Hello there. Something that I've noticed, and which certain commenters have picked up on, is that antler arrows are relatively similar in shape to medieval bodkin points. This raises the question, how well would they fare against medieval armor? Hence today's tests. Now, we know that Leif Erikson led a couple of expeditions of Vikings to Newfoundland, and that they were driven back by the Beothuk. Today we're going to be testing the sort of thing that Erikson might have worn on his expedition. Now, I'm going to open with the caveat that my medieval armor is not 100% historically accurate. Every element is historically plausible, but none of it is 100%. So you don't have to go down in the comments and tell me that I'm doing my tests wrong. I know I'm doing them wrong. The first piece I want to test is a Gambeson. This is the sort of Gambeson that you would wear under your armor. It's made of 2 layers of canvas with 1 layer of thick wool sandwiched in between. Now, there's zero evidence for the Vikings having used gambesons, but I think it's plausible, so here we go. The first thing I'm testing is a slate arrowhead. I want to see if the armor can break it. The arrow survived, but it also didn't penetrate very deeply, only about 1/4 of an inch. Just enough to make you mad. Let's try another one. This time the arrow penetrated the armor by about 1/2 an inch. You wouldn't be happy about it, but nothing to complain about. Given how fragile these slate arrows have been in all my other tests, I was not expecting them to survive impact with the Gambeson. They aren't penetrating very well, but I think that this is mainly due to the broadness of the head on this particular arrow, and the lack of a particularly sharp edge. I don't have any flint arrows as of filming this, so I can't test them, but I speculate that they'd go through a lot better than the slate arrows, seeing as how the canvas doesn't seem rigid enough to shatter the arrows. This one penetrated only about 1/8 of an inch. The wearer probably wouldn't even have been cut. Well, my arrows survived 3 shots. I don't want to push my luck, so let's switch over to the antler arrows. These have proven themselves very good at going through wooden armor. Let's see how they do against canvas, considering they have no cutting edge. The arrow took quite a bit of getting out. It penetrated about 6 inches. The armor would not have saved you. This is interesting. Here the arrow struck the loose hanging fabric towards the bottom of the Gambeson, and it only penetrated about 2 inches. More air to absorb the impact, I guess? Anyway, not quite deep enough to put you out of the fight, but you'd be in a pretty bad way. Here the arrow penetrated about 4 inches. The armor would not have saved you. Here it struck a loose fold in the armor and did not penetrate. Again, about 6 inches. The armor would have been of no use. Let's move on to the next piece. I'm going to be testing a mail coif. This is made from budded mail. There's a bit of debate about whether or not budded mail was used during the Viking Age. On the other hand, there's only one piece of riveted mail that has survived. So is that really conclusive? The last known example of budded mail in a Western European context was manufactured around 650 AD. Regardless of whether or not it was used, this is what I have, so this is what I'm going to be testing. In the past, I've tested this mail against medieval arrows. Against bodkin points it did very badly, and against broadhead points it did quite well. Here the arrow penetrated about 5 inches and split open a couple of rings. The armor wouldn't have saved you, but it's interesting that it did better than the Gambeson. Commenter's been yelling at me for leaving in the missed shots, so I'm only going to include a couple here. Here the arrow struck the head of the coif. The head of the coif includes a woolen liner. the same sort of wool that's inside the Gambeson. This is interesting. It seems like the male took all the force out of the arrow and it was unable to penetrate the cloth underneath. And the same sort of thing happens again, although this time it also struck at a weird angle, so that could be more to do with it. Here the arrow penetrates about 3 inches. The armor wouldn't have saved you, but it's still a heck of a lot better than the Gambeson. About 6 inches this time. Against the male, the antler arrows are performing identically to bodkin points. Interesting. Let's see that again in slow motion. The arrow struck a loose fold of male and zinged off harmlessly. The next thing I'd like to test is a leather lamellar breastplate. Now I don't want to get bogged down about whether or not they used leather armor back in the Middle Ages, and I don't want to get bogged down about whether or not the Vikings used lamellar. Let's just say that I've done my research, and I think it's plausible that these were used. Let's leave it at that and get on with the test, shall we? In previous tests, this breastplate has done excellently against bodkin points. Let's see how it fares today. Bounced off harmlessly. Here it struck near the bottom of the armor and glanced off. Interesting that leather is capable of deflecting things. Again, it bounces off harmlessly. The mesh of fibers in a thick piece of leather like this is too tight for these arrows to force their way through. It struck near the very edge and bounced off harmlessly. Another bounce. And another one. And another one. Now I'd like to show some of the damage that the leather sustained. Apologies for the shaky camera. None of the arrows managed to penetrate the leather. Some of them didn't even penetrate the surface layer, just leaving a little dent. Here it struck one of the lacing holes, and even then refused to penetrate. Thumbs up for me. Now we're going to be testing the male over the Gambeson. Now this is really interesting. It seems my earlier suspicion was true. The male takes all the force out of the arrow, allowing the Gambeson to turn it. This is really neat. The male and the Gambeson are worthless on their own, but together they're proof against these arrows. Neat. The Spanish conquistadors, when writing about the southeast of North America, describe antler-tipped arrows that are strong enough to go through a steel breastplate. Now, I don't have a steel breastplate to test, but here's a piece of 20-gauge steel paneling. This should serve as a reasonable stand-in for munitions-grade armor. The arrow left a tiny little dent which doesn't show up well on camera as the metal is dented already, but it did not penetrate. The arrow also broke in 2 places. The tip of the arrowhead sheared off. The shaft of the arrow also snapped just below the head. I don't quite buy the idea of arrows piercing a steel breastplate. I think the conquistadors were probably lying to us to sound big. And that's it for today's tests. Bye-bye.